A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Greg Bondar is National Spokesperson for Christian Voice Australia. Good to check in with him. That's a national think tank and advocacy group for families, liberty and faith. Greg Bondar, a special welcome back to 2020.
Oh, thank you, Neil, for the opportunity to talk to you again.
Hey, Greg, let's talk about this topic of pornography, and sometimes difficult one to talk about. We don't mind talking about it on the radio. It's not always as easy to talk about actually in church. But Christians are not immune from pornography. Let's have a little talk about this now. You've been doing some research. How widespread is pornography use even among Christians?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Look, this is a fairly sensitive topic, as you would appreciate, but it's something that we can't just ignore and sweep under the carpet, Neil, because the research indicates that there are 4 out of 5 Christians have a history of pornographic use. And the biggest issue that's come out of this survey that I've been looking at, Neil, is that they claim that they have nobody to help them avoid pornography. So that's a real issue, Neil, for Christians and, of course, non-Christians as well. But isn't that an interesting figure?
It is, because nobody to help them, and that begs the question, doesn't it? Does the Christian church, no matter what flavour, denomination, does it have a role in helping to address the issue here? Is it time for the church to maybe step up here? What is your thought here?
Yeah, absolutely, Neil. As you know, I do a lot of chaplaincy work, and I've been talking to a few guys about the issues that they're facing, especially in terms of their family. You know, they say to me that, you know, I love my wife, I sort of respect her and all that, and as they should, but they still struggle as Christians with issues of pornography. And they tell me that, you know, the church that they attend in particular have never addressed the topic of pornography. Now, the research indicates, Neil, that many congregants want their church to address pornography, but how you go about it's a different issue. But the point is that should the church be filling the gap where men and women, but men in particular, are finding a need to have somebody help them through their struggle, Neil?
Interesting, isn't it? When I sometimes reflect on the fact that what we refer to as mental health today is something that the Christian church has been dealing with for 2,000 years, because that's what the gospel really addresses so powerfully. But when we talk about the hidden effects of pornography on mental health and relationships, I guess the point where you're going to get to an appreciation that you've got to address it somehow. That's the challenge, isn't it?
Absolutely, Neil, because you see, the questions we need to answer are, you know, how widespread is it among Christians? Well, I've not done a survey, so I suspect, based on the figures that I've gathered from overseas, it's quite prevalent among Christians as well as non-Christians. But interestingly, it affects both men and women. And the other thing that came out of the survey was that, you know, Christians have a conflicting view about pornography, which worries me a little bit, Neil, because, you know, they have different beliefs about the impact of pornography. But it's something I think that needs to be raised at the church level. Men and women are struggling with it. And I think this is something, Neil, that's going to really come to the fore, because you and I both know, if you watch TV, social media, what have you, Neil, I can't watch a TV show now without 4-letter word coming out, you know, or something like LGBTIQ or something in the movie. And I think that's a real issue for people that are struggling with pornography now.
Stay with this and the church for a few moments. I know that occasionally some churches will send an anonymous survey out to their congregants, and they'll get responses on various questions, and just to glean the way that people are thinking about church life. And I note that there is some detail in the sort of detail of the study that you were looking at, that actually 58% of Christians and churched adults said it would be important for their church to address the issue Give us your insight here as to how you might go about actually just notifying the church or your pastor that there might be some need to address these issues.
Yeah, look, Neil, that's a good question, because the survey does reflect that. But interestingly, let's just go back a step, because traditionally, the traditional view of the church was that, you took punitive measures. There was shame and guilt and isolation, and that was the way we were brought up, I guess. The new approach amongst churches tends to be, Neil, a compassionate approach where it's destigmatizing the issue. So the church has to decide, where do we address this? Do we address it in our home groups, at our men's groups, or do we address it at the pulpit on a Sunday? It's something I think the church needs to look at, because, believe you me, Neil, men and women sitting in the pews are struggling with the issues, Neil, and they need to be able to reach out.
I imagine that a lot of people think that the traditional approach, as you mentioned, is something that has to be addressed front on, because you can have some proof text here and there, and as you say, shame and guilt and isolation. If you address it in such a way as just coming out with some proof text about lust and sexual immorality and adultery and all of those sorts of things, somehow or other a compassionate approach has to be there, because if you come with a heavy-handed baseball bat and try and hit people over the head talking about pornography, well, they're not going to come back to church, are they? Isn't that the way I guess most leaders might be thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what would happen is, if you take that approach, to the old traditional approach, you're going to isolate. What you're going to do is, you're going to disenfranchise these people from their congregation. I think it's wrong. I think they need help. By help, I mean counselling. They need pastoral care. As a chaplain, as I said to you, Neil, I was talking to some men recently, and they're saying it's a real issue. But what's disturbing, Neil, is that I've found since then that even pastors sometimes struggle with the issue of pornography. So it's not just a one-way street, Neil. So that's another issue that the church needs to look at as well.
One of those things, isn't it, to recognise if you have a problem, you need to seek some help. And maybe that's within your church, maybe that's outside of your church, maybe that's with an accountability group. However, but if you just keep on keeping that little secret, it may well actually turn into some challenging issues for your mental health and for your marriage and family relationships, which are really, really very important. Hey, let's move on. You recently had the privilege of attending a Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship International meeting in Canberra. Tell us about it.
Well, Neil, last weekend, I have to tell you, I attended the Full Gospel Men's Fellowship International. Neil, look, I'm a traditional conservative Christian. And I got to tell you, when I got into this, over 100 Pentecostal Christians that, we were doing healing and speaking in tongues, I said to myself, I'm at the wrong church meeting, or I'm at the wrong conference, because it was all new to me, Neil, as a conservative Anglican. I have to tell you, this is all new. But I've got to tell you, Neil, it was wonderful to see that the gospel was still being taught. And in particular, the mission of the Full Gospel ministry is basically to reach men, call men back to God, believers to be baptised, fulfil the Great Commission, provide Christian fellowship, and bring unity among the people in the body of Christ. Now, they are all objectives that I identify with, but not so much, Neil. I don't have the gift of speaking in tongues. I don't know about you, Neil, but it's an eye-opening event for me, I have to tell you.
Okay, well, let's just stay with this for a moment. Being very Pentecostal, no doubt, with all of those chapters of FGB, MFI all around the country and even all around the world, there are going to be some leaderships that are very Pentecostal, and there are going to be some that are a little more Anglican in your flavour. Some that are going to be sort of a bit more reformed in other flavours and things like that too. So I imagine it's about the leaders. But one of the things that always impresses me about FGB gatherings is the fact that somebody stands up and they tell their testimony. And I think their testimony sometimes is going to be more traditional, sometimes can be Reformed, sometimes it's going to be evangelical, sometimes Pentecostal. So I imagine that freedom there for just people to tell their story is what this is all about.
Neil, you have hit the nail on the head, because one of the things that came up, we heard 3 testimonies at dinner, then the other night as well. And there was a woman that came up, Neil, a wonderful lady, I won't mention her name, and she gave her testimony. And I have to tell you, Neil, I'm a pretty tough guy, but I had tears coming down my eyes, because she was telling us about the struggle of going through family, business, relationships, loss of life, loss of husband, and how she found Christ in the midst of all that. And I have to tell you, Neil, that it was so encouraging. Point of fact, I've invited her to come and speak at a conference that I'm running next year at the Every Home for Christ. But Neil, testimony is it's a great way to reach out to people, I have to tell you. But again, some of them were a bit weird. Others were so enlightening, Neil.
And I guess a good opportunity to encourage listeners to find out if there is a chapter of FGB MFI in your local community, and check them out. Support the dinners that they hold. You'll have a great time. You'll meet new friends. You'll hear someone's testimony. And if it's not your flavour, don't worry about that. You might be asked to give your testimony the following week. Hey, a new movie out, Greg, called Average Joe. Give us your insights here into this one.
Now, Neil, you've got a good memory, I know you have, but I interviewed Joe Kennedy in November 2023, and I spoke to Joe about the fact that, the fact that he went through all this issue of religious freedom, freedom of speech, and Neil, he was so encouraging. He gave me a copy of his book, which I've read, but importantly, Neil, that the average Joe, here's a guy that after a football match, knelt down and prayed. And it got to the stage where he was eventually sacked. And after being sacked, he said to his wife, Denise, what do I do? So do you fight for your right to believe, to have freedom of speech, or do you just sort of toss it all in, and leave it? Well, he fought. Neil, he fought, went to the Supreme Court and won. And now we can see all of this on film, which is being released on the 10th of October, a couple of days ago. Yeah.
And we're talking about an American story here, Joe Kennedy. And I always am quite reflective on the fact that coaches in the American sports context have such a high level of respect. They are true community leaders, coaches of sporting teams and organisations in the US. So the fact that the coach wanted to kneel down and pray, eventually was sacked for that in an American context, and then had to fight his way all the way to the Supreme Court. That's the highest court in America, the Supreme Court. But the beauty of this is, and this shows what the coach really brings to his team, the way that his character came to the fore in taking up the fight all the way to the top. That's a pretty significant thing, and that's something of his Christian character on display.
Absolutely, Neil. And, the question that we as Christians need to answer is this. Are we prepared to fight for our belief, our biblical worldview? Are we prepared to defend religious freedom of speech, if you will, at whatever cost? Now, Neil, this cost him a lot. It cost him so much in terms of personal anguish, and not only that, it affected his marriage. I was talking to Joe, as I said, I had interviewed him on my webinar, and he was telling me privately that it had a lot of impact on him. So, Neil, are you prepared? Am I prepared? Are your listeners prepared to defend their faith in public, and at what cost? So this is the real issue, because we're talking about religious freedom, Religious Discrimination Act, we're talking about all sorts of issues. to what extent are we prepared to go out into the public arena and defend our faith, Neil?
Well, Average Joe's story, as you say, Greg, embodying the essence of courage and of resilience and the pursuit of justice, and asking that question, how far are we all prepared to go when we're put on the spot, when we have to either stand for what is true and right according to our faith, or bend and go along with some sort of woke agenda. And there's a movie that's about how you stand in the face of that. Greg Bondar is National Spokesperson for Christian Voice Australia. You can connect with Greg at christianvoiceaustralia.blog. christianvoiceaustralia.blog. It's a national think tank and advocacy group for families, liberty and faith. Greg Bondar, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us once again today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil, and God bless.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.